The wind had a bite to it that morning, sharp enough to slice through wool when the stagecoach rattled over the frozen ground and pulled up to the depot. Folks barely looked up from their business until the door swung open and a woman in a travel-worn blue gown stepped down clutching a carpetbag like it held her last coin. Her cheeks were wind-burned lips, cracked the seams of her dress drawn too tight from weeks of hard miles. A tall man in a banker's coat came forward, eyes sweeping her from bonnet to boots, his expression tightening in an instant. Whatever words he had meant to greet her with never came. Instead, he shook his head, turned his back, and walked away, leaving her standing in the dust with every gaze in Dry Hollow fixed on her. Before I tell you what happened after that, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and tap like and subscribe if you've ever had one moment change the course of your life. My name is Rosa Lindley, and until that morning, I had never set foot west of the Alleghenies. I was raised in Philadelphia in a brick row house where my father ran a small carpentry shop and my mother kept to her sewing table, making do with what we had. We were not rich, but there was dignity in our work. The Sabbath was for church and supper with neighbors, and the rest of the week was for earning your keep with your own two hands. After my father passed, my mother remarried a man whose measure of worth had nothing to do with kindness. He called me proud for wanting honest work instead of charity, and soon enough, the door was open for me to leave. The letter from Dry Hollow had seemed like a lifeline, then an offer of a home, a husband, a place where my hands could be useful again. I traded the steady hum of the city for the promise of mountain air, thinking a rancher's life would be hard, but fair. Instead, I stepped down from that coach into a world where money was loud and judgment louder still. Dry Hollow's main street was lined with the kind of false front buildings you see in towns that sprang up fast bank mercantile livery, each one backed by the will of men like Walter Beard and his son Emery, who thought a handshake was only worth the paper it was written on. I had come ready to work, ready to learn, with nothing but a carpetbag and the clothes on my back. Yet within a minute of meeting me, the man who had sent for me decided I was not the shape or size he wanted standing beside him in church. He spoke it plain enough for half the town to hear. My ticket west had been one way, and there was no room in the boarding house for a woman with no coin and no kin. I could feel the cold creeping deeper into my bones as I stood there on that platform, the sound of the stagecoach wheels fading into the hills, then through the thin veil of dust. I caught sight of a wagon pulled up across the street, its driver watching me with eyes as pale as the winter sky. He climbed down slow and steady and started toward me. Gabe Harlan's boots crunched over the frost as he came toward me, a duster coat drawn tight against the wind and a felt hat pulled low. Up close, he was taller than I'd guessed, broad through the shoulders, his beard touched with early gray. He didn't look like a man who came to town for company. He stopped a few feet away, eyes steady on mine, and tilted his head toward a wagon standing hitched across the street. "It's mine," he said, voice low and even. I glanced toward the depot office, then back at him. "Where to?" I asked. "West," that was all. The cold had started to work through my coat, and I could feel the eyes on my back from the depot window. There was no money in my bag for another ticket, no family waiting anywhere. I lifted my carpetbag, stepped down off the boardwalk, and followed him. He helped me up into the wagon without a word, then climbed in beside me and took the reins. The mules leaned forward into the traces, and we rolled out of Dry Hollow with the sound of iron rims on frozen ruts fading behind us. We didn't speak on the road. The land began to change after a few miles, the open prairie giving way to pine stands where the wind moved quieter. Gabe's coat was thick and lined with wool smelling faintly of wood smoke. He pulled it from his own shoulders and handed it across when he saw me shiver. I wrapped it around me, the warmth settling in slow. His eyes stayed on the trail ahead, his hands steady on the reins. The track narrowed until we turned through brush and into a small clearing. A cabin sat at the edge roof, patched but sound, a wisp of smoke curling from the chimney. Beside it stood a small barn and a stacked row of split wood under canvas. Gabe set the brake, climbed down, and came around to help me to the ground. His grip was firm but not hurried. Inside, the air was warmer, with a faint glow from the stove in the far corner. A table with 2 chairs sat near a shelf of jars, a cot pushed against the wall. A rifle leaned in the corner by the door. He pointed to a peg near the entry. "You can hang the coat there." I slipped it off my dress beneath, showing every mile it had traveled. The tear in one sleeve and dust along the hem caught the firelight. He didn't comment. Instead, he moved to the stove, opened the door, and laid in fresh wood. "I'll fix something," he said, reaching for a pot. I offered to help, and he nodded toward a sack of potatoes. We worked side by side, trading tools without fuss, the quiet broken only by the scrape of a knife or the rattle of dried beans into the pot. When the stew was done, we ate at the table. The flavor was plain but hot, and it eased the knot in my stomach. Gabe finished first, wiped his spoon, and stood. "You can take the cot," he said. I looked toward it, then back at him. "And you?" "I'll use the chair." I shook my head. "I can sleep near the stove." He studied me for a moment, then nodded and went out to check the barn. While he was gone, I laid my dress over a chair to dry and pulled the coat back around my shoulders. My hair, unpinned, fell in loose waves past my shoulders. When he returned, he didn't glance at it, just set his boots aside and lowered himself into the chair with a quiet grunt. The fire popped in the stove, and outside the wind swept against the walls. Morning came gray and cold. Gabe had been up before me, the smell of coffee hanging in the air. He set a mug on the table and nodded toward a bowl of oats. "I've got chores. Stay close to the fire." I met his eyes. "I can help." His brow drew down. "Don't need you to." "I didn't ask if you did," I said. After a pause, he stepped outside and came back with a folded bundle, canvas trousers, a flannel shirt, boots, and a wool hat. I changed behind the partition, rolling the trousers at the cuffs and tying my hair back. The boots were scuffed but warm. Outside, the snow crunched underfoot. Gabe handed me a fork and motioned toward the barn. We worked through the morning, pitching hay, mending stalls, carrying water. My hands blistered quickly, but I wrapped them in cloth and kept pace. At midday, we sat by the barn, sharing bread and jerky from the same cloth sack. By afternoon, the sky had darkened with fresh clouds. Gabe limped more heavily as we worked, the cold stiffening his leg. We finished as the first flakes started to fall again. Inside, I rubbed salve on my palms from a small tin near the stove. Gabe glanced over. "Wear gloves tomorrow." I nodded, hanging the coat near the fire to dry. That night, the wind rose, rattling the shutters. I lay closer to the stove, the warmth steady against my back. Gabe sat in the chair, a small book in his hands. When a sharp gust made the cabin creak, I flinched. He closed the book, stood, and added another log to the fire. "You warm enough?" he asked. "Yes. You could tell me if you weren't." I nodded, and he returned to the chair. The third morning dawned hard and cold. The snow crusted over so that boots cracked through the surface. Gabe was already outside, hammering a post back into place by the corral. "Fence lines down on the east ridge," he said when I joined him. We loaded tools and rope onto a sled and set out. The trail climbed into open ground, the wind sharper there. At the ridge, the fence sagged under the weight of snow. I offered to carry a beam. Gabe hesitated, then handed it over, telling me to lift straight. We worked side by side for hours, digging out post holes, tying wire, and setting new rails. He didn't slow his pace for me, and I didn't ask him to. When the last post was in place, we sat on a rock under bare aspen branches, passing a canteen between us. "You were married before," I said quietly. Gabe's eyes stayed on the hills. "She died here, years ago." "She died here?" "She died here. Years ago." "She died here?" "Years 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 ago." "She died here? Childbirth. I gripped the canteen. I'm sorry. He nodded once. She thought she wanted the land. It wasn't what she expected. I met his gaze. I don't mind the quiet. I just wasn't ready for it to be permanent. His eyes held mine longer this time. Wasn't your fault. We started back as the light faded. Inside the cabin, I pulled off my gloves, the raw skin on my palms stinging in the warmth. Gabe crossed to the drawer and took out the salve again, handing it over without a word. The fire caught quick, and the smell of smoke filled the room. "You've got steady hands," he said. I gave a small laugh. "They don't feel steady." "They are." I moved to the hearth, stirring the fire. The shirt I wore slipped slightly at the shoulder before I adjusted it. Gabe's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Later, while I stood at the stove and he mended a boot at the table, I asked, "Why'd you help me?" He didn't look up right away. "Didn't seem right leaving you there." I nodded, the kettle hissing softly on the stove. Outside, the snow began to fall again. Inside, the firelight flickered against the walls, and the space between us felt different now. Still quiet, but not the kind that keeps people apart. By the end of that week, the rhythm of the ranch had settled around me. The mornings began before daylight, Gabe already pulling on his coat and boots, while the air still bit like steel. The first sounds were always the creak of the door hinges, the thump of his steps on the porch, and the crunch of his boots in the frozen yard. I'd dress in the flannel and trousers he'd given me, wrap my hands in cloth, and follow him outside. The cold sliced through the seams, but once the work began, the sting faded into the heat of movement. We fed the cattle first, hauling hay from the barn to the corral in slow, even loads. Gabe worked without wasted motion, and I matched his pace as best I could. The first days, my muscles burned from the lifting, but I kept my grip tight on the pitchfork, letting the work steady my thoughts. When the animals were fed, we'd break ice from the water troughs, the chunks clattering onto the snow like glass. The barn stayed warmer than the yard, with the smell of hay and horses holding against the cold. By midday, the snow clouds would begin to move across the ridge, dimming what little warmth the sun offered. We'd take our meals sitting on upturned buckets, or along the fence rail bread jerky and water from a shared canteen. Gabe never filled the silence with unnecessary talk, but his glances carried the weight of someone taking the measure of what he saw. I noticed how he favored his left leg more on days when the cold set deep, though he never spoke of it. One afternoon, the fence on the lower pasture needed mending where the snow had pushed it down. We worked side by side, the sound of the mallet striking posts carrying over the open ground. My gloves were worn thin, and I felt the raw edge of the rope bite through the fabric as I tied the last length of wire. Gabe handed me a nail without looking up, and I took it with my fingers stiff from the wind. When the job was done, we stood back watching the line hold against the weight of snow still packed along its base. Later, back at the cabin, I worked the salve into my hands while the fire cracked and settled in the stove. Gabe watched for a moment before saying, "You take to the work like you've done it before." I shook my head. "Not this, but I've seen enough to learn." He nodded once as if that was all that needed saying. The days blurred together in that way winter days can sky-pale ground, hard the air sharp enough to make every sound carry. The distance between us shortened without words. I'd find myself standing closer when we worked in the barn, our shoulders almost touching as we reached for tools. Sometimes he'd brush past me to get to a shelf or move behind me to take something from the peg on the wall. Those small moments built into a quiet understanding neither of us named. One evening after the chores were done and the wind had begun to rattle the shutters, we sat near the stove, each working on our own task. I was mending a tear in the cuff of my shirt. Gabe was oiling a leather harness. When a gust shook the door on its hinges, I glanced up to see his eyes on me. He didn't look away, and for a few heartbeats, the silence was heavier than the storm outside. The next morning came with a sky the color of tin, the air holding the stillness, that comes before snow. Gabe mentioned checking the east fence again, and I was already pulling on my gloves before he'd finished speaking. The trail out was rough ice crusting in the shadows. At the top of the rise, we stopped to look over the valley, the land rolling white and quiet under the winter light. While he replaced a rail, I asked without thinking, "Do you ever get used to the quiet out here?" He paused, the hammer resting in his hand. "You don't get used to it. You carry it." The words hung in the air, carried off by the wind, but I knew he'd given me the truest answer he had. We worked until the last rail was set and the wire pulled tight. On the way back, the clouds thickened and flakes began to drift down, melting as they touched the shoulders of my coat. By the time we reached the cabin, the snow was falling steady, the ground already taking a new layer. Inside, the warmth wrapped around us as the door closed. Gabe set his tools by the wall, brushed snow from his hat, and moved to the stove. I poured water into the kettle, the tin handle warm in my palm. As I passed behind him to set it on the stove, my arm brushed his. He didn't move, and neither did I for a moment. The firelight caught along the edge of his jaw before I stepped past and took my place at the table. We ate with the snow still falling outside, the light fading early. Gabe cleared his plate, set it in the wash basin, and leaned one hand on the table. "You work hard," he said. "Harder than most would in your place." I met his eyes. "I came here to work." He nodded, a quiet agreement passing between us that didn't need more words. That night the wind rose again, and the cabin seemed smaller against the sound. I lay closer to the stove, the blanket pulled high. Across the room, Gabe sat in his chair, eyes half closed, one hand resting on his knee. Another gust shook the door, and the lamp flickered. I caught him looking over the firelight, soft on his face. He didn't speak, but the way he watched made it clear the distance between us was not as wide as it had been. By morning, the snow had stopped, leaving the world bright and sharp. The sky was so clear it made the air seem colder. Gabe stepped outside to fetch wood, the door closing behind him with a solid thud. I moved to the window, watching his broad frame against the white, his steps sure despite the limp. Something about the sight settled in my chest, though I couldn't have put words to it. When he came back in setting the logs by the stove, he glanced at me for a moment longer than needed. Then he reached for his coat and said, "I'll be in the north pasture today." I nodded, already pulling on my gloves to join him. It was mid-morning when the sound of hooves carried over the ridge, sharp, fast, not the slow gait of a rancher coming back from pasture. Gabe had been outside splitting wood, the steady rhythm of the axe stopping as he turned toward the sound. I stepped onto the porch, wiping my hands on my apron, and saw a lone rider break through the tree line. His coat flapped against the wind, and the badge on his chest caught the light as he reined in near the corral. "Harland," he called, shifting in the saddle. Gabe set the axe down, his expression unreadable. "What's your business, Cooper?" The deputy's eyes slid toward me for just a moment before turning back to Gabe. "Banker's boy says you've got the woman who came in on last week's stage. Claims she owes him for the fare, says she ran off." I kept my chin high, standing just inside the porch rail. Gabe looked back at me. "You owe him?" "No," I said, my voice steady. Gabe turned to Cooper. "Then she's not running." Cooper studied him for a beat. "You admitting she's here? She's not property, she's staying." Gabe answered plain and final. The deputy shifted in his saddle, adjusting his gloves. "I'll tell him you said so. Folks will talk." Gabe didn't reply, and Cooper wheeled his horse around, riding back toward town. The snow had started again. Small flakes drifting between us as Gabe came up the steps. He didn't look at me as he passed into the cabin, only went straight to the stove and added wood to the fire. "I didn't expect them to come looking," I said. "They came to make noise," he answered. "You didn't have to say I was here." He met my eyes. "I don't lie." The weight of it settled between us. I moved to the table, pulling the kettle down to fill it. As I reached past him to set it on the stove, my hand brushed his. He didn't pull away. "Why speak for me?" I asked. He scraped beans into a pot before answering. "I've been alone a long time, sometimes too long. Leaving you out there with no place to go wasn't decent." I nodded, the heat from the stove warming my hands. That evening after chores, he stayed at the table while I cleared the dishes. The firelight softened the edges of the room, and for the first time since arriving, I felt less like I was waiting to be sent away. The thaw came slow over the next weeks. Snow shrank back from the fence lines, leaving deep mud where the ground had been frozen. The air still cut sharp in the mornings, but by midday, the sun carried some warmth. I'd stopped asking where I stood in Gabe's life. The answers seemed to be in the work we shared, the quiet meals, and the way he'd hand me a tool without needing to speak. I wore his shirts now, without thought sleeves, rolled ropes cinched at the waist of the trousers. Some mornings when the stove had burned low in the night, I'd pull one of his heavier coats over my shift until the cabin warmed. He never remarked on it, but I'd catch him watching from the doorway before stepping outside. One afternoon, I was hauling water from the creek when I noticed him on the roof, checking for damage. The limp was worse when he climbed, but his balance held. "You shouldn't be up there alone," I called. He grunted, "I ain't that fragile." I smiled to myself and went back to work. That night, we stood shoulder to shoulder at the stove, me slicing potatoes while he seasoned meat. Our arms brushed when I reached for the kettle, and neither of us moved away. Later, as I sat brushing my hair near the fire, he worked on a harness at the table. "Ever think of leaving here?" I asked. "Used to," he said without looking up. "Why didn't you?" "Too tired and nothing out there I wanted." His eyes met mine then. Now I asked, "Don't know yet." A few nights later, I couldn't sleep. The fire had burned low, the cabin too warm for blankets. Gabe stirred in his chair. "Cold?" he asked. "Too warm," I said, sitting up. I offered him the cot, but instead he crossed the floor and sat beside me. "You've been kind to me," I said, "but I'm not broken. Never thought you were." His hand found mine, his thumb moving over the back of it. I leaned into his shoulder, the quiet around us, holding steady. When I lifted my head, he was watching me. We met in a brief, steady kiss. "You don't have to stay alone anymore," I said. His hand brushed a curl back from my face. "I know." That night, he didn't return to the chair. And by morning, the air between us had shifted. We didn't speak of it, but the silence felt settled in a different way. The days followed with the same work, mending, planting, tending stock, but the space between us had changed. Sometimes his hand would touch my back as he passed, or he'd stand close in the barn while we worked. These moments came without effort, part of the life we were building without naming it. It was near dusk when the next knock came heavy against the cabin door. Gabe's head came up from where he was cleaning his rifle. I was at the table, the mending in my hands, gone still. He set the rifle aside and moved to the door, the lamplight stretching his shadow across the floor. The knock was heavy enough to rattle the latch. Gabe opened the door, and the light from outside fell across a figure in a fine new coat boots, polished hair slicked back. Emery Beard stood on the porch, his face red from the ride, his eyes scanning the room past Gabe's shoulder until they landed on me. "I came to collect what's mine," he said, brushing dust from his sleeve like the air here was beneath him. Gabe's hand rested on the doorframe. "She's not yours?" Emery gave a short laugh. "I sent for her, paid her fare. That means something." I stepped forward, my hair loose from the day's work apron still dusted with soil. I met his eyes. "You paid for a letter and a ticket. Nothing more." His jaw tightened. "You were meant to be my wife. Instead, you ran off like some saloon girl." "I didn't run," I said. You turned me away in front of your father and half the town. Said I was too much for you. Now you want to claim me because someone else saw worth where you didn't." Gabe shifted, not stepping between us, but close enough that Emery had to lift his chin to keep eye contact. Emery's voice rose. "You think staying out here makes you better than me?" I took one step forward. "I'd rather sleep on dirt beside a man who respects me than sit at a banker's table with you." The silence after was tight as wire. Gabe's voice broke it. "You're not welcome here. Turn that horse around and don't come back." Emery's eyes flicked between us, his pride fraying. He spat into the dirt, then swung into the saddle. Without another word, he rode back toward the ridge, the sound of hooves fading into the trees. I stood on the porch, my hands curled tight at my sides. Gabe's voice came low. "You all right?" I nodded. "I'm not scared of him. I just hate that I let men like that define my worth for so long." Gabe stepped closer. "He never saw you." I met his eyes. "And you did." His hand found my waist steady. "From the moment you sat on that platform and didn't cry." That night inside the cabin, I lit the lamp while he closed the door. I turned to him and began unbuttoning my dress, slow, not in shame, but in trust. He came to me without hurry, his hands cupping my face like he'd known the shape of it all along. Later, wrapped in the blanket beside the fire, my head on his chest, I said quietly, "This feels like home." He didn't speak, but his hand tightened around mine. The days after passed without sign of Emery or any rider from town. The work went on: fence repairs, turning the soil for planting, tending the stock. The thaw quickened patches of green, pushing through where the snow had pulled back. In the mornings, I wore my mended blue dress, the one I'd arrived in now, patched and taken in at the waist. It still pulled across my chest, but I wore it without trying to hide. Gabe no longer kept his distance. His coat hung beside mine by the door. Our mugs sat side by side on the shelf. When we crossed paths in the small kitchen space, his hand might rest lightly on my back, or my fingers would brush his arm without thought. These were not grand gestures, but they were steady, and they stayed. One afternoon, Gabe went to town for supplies. When he returned, he set a new kettle on the table, then handed me a small box wrapped in cloth. Inside was a silver ring laid on a folded scrap of lace. He didn't kneel, didn't make a speech. "You've been calling this home," he said. "I want you to call it yours." I slid it on without hesitation. It already is. That evening, we sat by the fire. After a while, he asked, "Do you want to get married proper?" "I don't need paper," I said, "but I'd like to hear you say it." He looked at me. "You are mine, from the first day I saw you." By the end of May, the last of the potatoes were in the ground. That day, my belly ached in a way I couldn't place. A week later, I missed my time. When I told him, he didn't blink. He only pulled me close, pressing a kiss to my temple. Then, "We'll make room for more." By summer, the cabin no longer felt like a place for one man. 2 coats hung by the door. 2 sets of boots rested by the fire. Every evening we stood together at the porch rail, watching the sun drop behind the hills, our arms touching. No words were needed. What mattered was what stayed. By early June, the land was green clear to the far hills. The air carried the scent of pine and warm soil, and the creek ran high with meltwater. Days began with Gabe and me walking the rows in the garden, checking sprouts and pulling weeds before the sun rose too high. His stride was slower in the mornings, the limp more pronounced after sleep, but by midday he moved with the same sure rhythm I'd come to know. Inside the cabin, our lives had fallen into an easy pattern. I baked bread every 3rd day, cut vegetables for supper, and kept the stove warm when Gabe worked out past the north pasture. He'd return with the smell of leather and dust clinging to him, setting his gloves on the table before washing up. Some evenings we'd eat in near silence, other times trading short words about the herd or the weather rolling in from the west. The silver ring he'd given me stayed on my finger through every chore. When I hung wash on the line, the sun caught it in a way that drew my eye without fail. It was a plain band, but it felt solid the same way the porch rail felt under my palms when we stood together at dusk. One morning, Gabe came in from the barn with a folded list in his hand. "Heading into town for supplies tomorrow," he said. I asked if he wanted me to come along. "No," he answered, "but I want to bring something back." I left it at that, though the curiosity settled in the back of my mind. He rode out at first light the next day. I kept myself busy mending a tear in one of his shirts, sweeping the porch, and tending the garden. The sun had dropped low when I heard his horse on the trail. He stepped down from the saddle with 2 items in hand, a new kettle and a small box wrapped in cloth. "For you," he said, placing the box in my palm. Inside, nestled on a scrap of lace, was the ring I still wore. He'd polished it until it caught the fading light. "Figured it deserved a bit of shine," he said. I didn't have words, so I just took his hand, and we stood that way until the light faded. The next weeks passed with the steady rhythm of summer work. We repaired the south fence after a section gave way, planted more beans, and stacked hay in the barn loft. At night, we'd sit on the porch, the day's heat still in the boards under our boots, and watch the sky darken over the ridge. By late July, the days had grown long and hot. The creek ran lower, but the garden thrived rows of green against the dark soil. One afternoon, while pulling carrots, I felt a faint flutter low in my belly, a reminder of the life growing there. I told Gabe that evening. He set his tools aside, came to me, and laid his palm against my waist. "Then, we'll make room for more," he said simply. We began small changes, without speaking of them as plans. I moved my things from the trunk near the stove into the corner beside his cot, and he built a low shelf for extra linens. He cleared a space in the garden for herbs I wanted to plant and started cutting lumber for a bench long enough for 2. The cabin no longer felt like a place for one. 2 coats hung by the door, 2 mugs stayed on the table, 2 sets of boots dried by the fire after a long day's work. In the quiet hours, I'd catch Gabe watching me from the doorway, his expression steady as though measuring a truth he already knew. One evening, as the sun bled orange across the sky, we leaned on the porch rail. His arm rested against mine, solid and warm. We stayed like that until the shadows stretched long over the pasture. Gabe finally spoke. "You've made this place different." I met his eyes. "So have you." It was near dark when a faint sound reached us from the trail, the slow, deliberate clop of a single horse. Gabe straightened his gaze, fixed on the bend where the road disappeared into the trees. The rider came into view, a lone figure moving at an even pace, the brim of his hat low over his face. The horse stopped at the edge of the yard, and the man dismounted with unhurried steps. In the dim light, I could make out the glint of a badge on his vest. The man stepped into the yard, the gravel crunching under his boots. He was tall, with a weathered face and sharp eyes that took in the cabin, the garden, and finally the 2 of us standing on the porch. Gabe stayed still beside me, one hand resting on the rail. "Evening," the man said, touching the brim of his hat. "Name's Sheriff Tom Whitaker. I'm looking for Gabriel Turner." Gabe straightened, his voice steady. "You found him." The sheriff stepped closer, his spurs catching the last bit of light. "There's a matter we need to discuss. Might be better inside." I moved to open the door, and the 3 of us stepped into the cabin. The sheriff's boots left faint prints on the plank floor, dust from the trail settling into the grain. He took off his hat, holding it in both hands. "I've come from Jackson County," he began. "There's been word of a man fitting your description. A debt left unsettled and a dispute that turned to a fight." His eyes shifted briefly to me, then back to Gabe. A man was hurt bad. Gabe's jaw tightened, but he didn't look away. "I know the matter you're talking about. It was years back. I left before it got worse. Whitaker nodded slowly. That may be, but there's a judge riding circuit who wants to hear your side. I'm here to see you make it there. The air in the cabin felt heavy, the ticking of the mantel clock loud in the quiet. I folded my hands in front of me, watching Gabe's face. When Gabe asked, 2 days, Whitaker replied. We'll ride to Milford. Judge will be there by week's end. Gabe glanced at me, then a quick look that said more than words could. I could see the weight of it in his eyes, leaving now, not knowing how it might end. The sheriff set his hat back on his head and stepped toward the door. I'll be at the trading post tomorrow. Come find me before noon the next day. If you don't, well, I'll have to come looking. When he was gone, the sound of his horse faded slow down the trail. Gabe stayed by the door for a long moment before speaking. I've got to go. I moved closer. Then I'll come with you. He shook his head. This is something I need to face alone. If it goes wrong, I don't want you caught in it. We spent the next day working side by side, mending the fence and stacking wood, as though the rhythm might steady the air between us. Neither of us spoke much about what was coming. That night, the lantern light threw soft shadows across the cabin walls. Gabe packed a small bag, clean shirt, bread wrapped in cloth, a pouch of coffee. I slipped the polished silver ring from my finger and set it in his palm. Hold it until you come back. He closed his hand over it. I'll bring it back to you. We woke before sunrise the next morning. The air was cool, the grass wet with dew. Gabe saddled his horse while I stood on the porch, arms wrapped around myself. When he swung into the saddle, he looked down at me. 2 days. Wait for me here. I nodded, though my chest felt tight. He rode out without looking back, the steady beat of hoofs carrying him toward the road that wound east. The yard felt emptier once he was gone. I busied myself with chores, but my eyes kept drifting to the trail. The sun climbed, then sank, and still I waited. On the second evening, with the light fading and the air cooling, I heard the distant sound of a rider again. My hand stilled on the porch rail. Whoever it was, they were coming fast. The rider came into view just as the last of the light was slipping behind the ridge. At first I couldn't tell if it was Gabe. The dust from the trail blurred his shape, the hoofbeats carrying across the cooling air. When he reached the yard, I saw his face, tired, shadowed, but whole. I stepped down from the porch, my hands trembling as they met his. Gabe swung down from the saddle and pulled me close, holding on like the ground might give way beneath us. It's settled, he said quietly. The judge heard me out. Sheriff Whitaker stood by my word, and the charge was cleared. I'm free to come home. I felt the breath I'd been holding all those days finally leave me. We stood there a while, neither of us in a hurry to move. His horse shifted behind him, the leather creaking, the faint smell of dust and sweat clinging to both of them. Inside the cabin felt warmer with him in it. He set my ring on the table, the silver catching the lamplight. I slid it back onto my finger, the weight of it grounding me. That night we talked in low voices about what came next. The trouble was behind us, but the lesson stayed: how quickly the life you've built can be tested and how much it matters to have someone stand beside you when it is. In the days that followed, the rhythm of our work returned. We fixed the south fence, cleared brush from the creek, and hauled in firewood for the colder months ahead. The land seemed to breathe easier, the way it does after a hard storm passes. Sometimes when the evening light stretched long across the yard, I'd look toward the trail where he'd ridden away. I thought of all the miles between then and now, and how every step back had been a choice. The West teaches you many things: patience, grit, and how to live with the quiet between the loud moments. But more than that, it teaches you the worth of a steady heart and a kept promise. If you've ever weathered your own kind of storm, you know what it means to come through it still standing. And if you have someone who'll ride the trail back to you, well, that's worth holding on to. Thank you for sitting with me through this story. If it's left you thinking of your own, share it with someone who'll listen. Stories keep the trail lit for the rest of us.